You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Anna Zivarts from Disability Rights Washington and Paulo Nunes-Ueno from Front and Centered. They join us to talk about the Disability Mobility Initiative and Story Map, as well as the Mobility Bill of Rights. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous, amazing Patreon supporters. It's 2022, and we're celebrating 8 years of the Talking Headways podcast. So to join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $10 a month will still get you a bus-only scarf. I promise I'm still working on new designs and formats. $2 a month will get you stickers and a handwritten note, but any support is welcome and much appreciated. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Today's podcast is also brought to you by the projects of The Overhead Wire. Whether it's our daily newsletter first established in 2006 or our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic Town Planning and Practice, find out more today at theoverheadwire.com. Anna Zivarts and Paulo Nunes-Ueno, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks.
Yeah, glad to be
Excited
here.
to be here.
Well, glad to have you all here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourselves? And we'll start with Anna and we'll go with Paulo after that.
Sure. So I am Anna. I live in Seattle, Washington, and I'm a mom. I'm low vision, and I'm the director of the Disability Mobility Initiative, which is a program of Disability Rights Washington.
And I'm Paulo Nunes-Ueno, and I am the Transportation and Land Use Policy Lead for Front and Centered in Washington State, and we're a climate justice organization. And I also have the incredible luck to work in fun transit projects and mobility projects across the country as a consultant.
When did you all start working together?
Last spring, really. We were both part of a coalition in Washington State working on transportation issues in the state level and came to recognize that we aligned pretty closely. Our organizations, the people we represent, our interests were really aligned. And I think we started doing some trips together as well, right? It was sort of really early when things were just kind of starting to open up a little bit in the pandemic. And we wanted to get out and start to highlight some of the stories of folks who didn't have transportation access in the state. I don't drive, so Paulo and I piled in his car and drove to some far and rainy parts of the state to hold live stream press events with the people whose stories we wanted to highlight.
I bet you had good conversations in those long rides.
Yeah, Paulo's a decent driver, at least. So I really dislike driving with people who are terrible drivers. It freaks me out.
I understand. Can you tell us more about the Disability Mobility Initiative?
Yeah, so it's a program I got to launch a little over a year ago at Disability Rights Washington. We are focused on the transportation needs of non-drivers, and we're an organizing program. So our emphasis is really bringing together people who don't have access to cars, people who can't drive, and making our voice part of the transportation planning and policy conversations here in Washington State, and increasingly, I think, more nationally and globally as well.
Do you find that the work kind of spills, like you said, spills over outside of Washington State fairly easily?
It's starting to, and that part is really exciting. So far, we've organized and collected the stories of around 200 folks from every legislative district in our state, and then put those stories together into a research paper. And we had the opportunity to present that the AASHTO Board of Directors meeting. So that was pretty exciting. Definitely, an audience that wasn't necessarily thinking about the transportation needs of non-drivers before that conversation very deeply. And I think we started to just crack open that door a little bit. And then, Paulo and I have done some press conversations like this, podcast conversations, and just starting to, I think there are other folks doing this work out there, but trying to make those connections and, make sure that we can start to have different voices to be part of the transportation planning and policy conversations, both in our, local cities, also in our local state legislatures, and at the federal level. And I think Paulo is engaged a bit more at the federal level than I am, so he can speak to that.
Yeah, there's been a really great conversation that was convened by the Transit Center and the Association for a Just Society, but it brought transit advocates together every week from across the country. And that has been really, really helpful in terms of helping us understand with these big proposals that are coming, hopefully still, and also the bipartisan infrastructure bill that is a done deal. what that might mean in terms of the good and the bad related to the priorities that we have in Washington state. So that was really helpful. And we're also finding that, hey, we have natural allies in California, in Oregon, potentially in Vancouver, BC as well, that are really interested in doing this work of linking our transportation investments to a justice approach, but also being very mindful that we understand that these things don't come without impacts. It's really been our experience that when we speak to legislators that, we're the ones that having to remind them that, when you build a highway, that has a long tail of emissions that impact climate, but also have very, very serious health effects to the people in those communities who are primarily Black and brown and who have been overburdened already by the impacts of our transportation system. So we think that there really are natural allies beyond Washington that we should be working with and that we can learn from.
Well, I really felt that reading the piece with all of the story map and everything that goes along with that. I mean, those are stories that are focused on experiences in Washington state, but it seems like you could take all of the expertise that's in those stories and you could, translate that to anywhere in the United States. It doesn't have to be very local. And so I felt like I was reading something that was not just focused on Washington, but was something you could translate to everywhere and would be helpful everywhere. So it feels like a policy document that, any transit agency could read, not just people reading from Washington state.
Definitely. I think, we have, like every state or most states, we have super rural areas that are in our state. We have big cities. We have areas that have become increasingly expensive because of all the economic growth that's been going on here. And that I think is, something that's been happening in a lot of different places in our country right now, where housing costs have gone way up. And especially for disabled folks on fixed income, low wage workers, right? The affordability of living in denser, better areas that are better served by transit, areas that are more walkable, rollable, that just is out of reach. And so, the system that the sort of really tenuous and mostly failing transportation system we had for non-drivers is actively becoming worse as housing prices go up. And so many folks are getting displaced further and further out. That, I think, is a concern that resonates in many communities throughout our country.
It seems like the main focus you all have for the report and for, access generally is that we are living in a system that's designed specifically for drivers and for cars, whereas, it looks like 25% or so of people don't have a car. And so if you have that large amount of people that don't have a car and you design a system for the other 75%, what happens to that initial group, the 25% that don't?
Exactly. Right. And we wish we had better numbers on that too, right? I mean, that's the best we could estimate from just the number of driver's licenses in Washington state. We're actually in the process right now of trying to get some additional funding for a research study through the legislature to be able to help us understand, who is out there who doesn't have reliable access to a car. What are the demographics of this population? What are the needs? And I would love to see that, as a census question, right? In the next census. It's not something that's explicitly asked about in the census or the American Community Survey. And it would be great. We don't know. And the other part of it is that, if you don't have access to transportation or mobility, you are often more isolated. And so I think decision makers and elected leaders just aren't aware that there is such a large percentage of the population that doesn't have this access, because it's a very isolated and very marginalized part of the population. And it's not people who have access to power or money.
And it leaves out kids. There's this notion that, the people that get to have a say in how our society is built, how the built environment are the people that can participate economically in society. But that's just false. That a 9-year-old girl has just as much right to be safe when she's traveling to school or to the store, or to her friends, as somebody who happened to have enough money to pay the $10,000 a year to own and maintain and insure and put gas in a car. And that's sort of where, the work that Front and Centered is doing and the work that Anna is doing at Disability Rights Initiative, at the Mobility Initiative, is so, relevant to real people, is that we're saying, hey, there are basic rights that need to be respected in transportation, that it's not simply a question of having paid the price of entry of owning a car, of being able to drive a car, that regardless of who you are, you need to be safe on the road. You need to be able to access some basic things. You need to be able to have reliable transit, for example. So one of the initiatives that we're working on is to try to create a frequent accessible transit standard, to say that, hey, over time, we've made it so that it's possible and reliable to drive between almost any 2 points on the map. And we should have a similar aspiration to make it possible for people to be able to get to the things that they need with transit. And so we're similar to what Anna is describing in terms of really understanding, well, who are the non-drivers? We want to be able to say, well, what is the level of transit access in Washington State in terms of percentage of the population that can walk on an accessible sidewalk to transit that runs 15 minutes or better day or night? And we know that that number is really, 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 really low. But why should we accept that? The analogy that we use is it's really hard to go and rent an apartment that doesn't have a toilet indoors. And that didn't happen by magic. That was a series of decisions and commitments that were made over decades to make it so that indoor plumbing is something that we take for granted. And safe sidewalks and decent transit should be that. It should be that because it's a pathway out of poverty, really strong one, but also because it's just key to being able to participate in society for everybody. So I'm really excited about this work, and I'm really excited about the partnership with Anna, because it's so much of the conversation. It's like we have a real sort of disparity in the terms that we use in transportation. There is a kind of, and in the way that we fund our transportation. People expect that the roads will be paved, the highways will be expanded when you get congestion, but you have to go up for a levy if you want to create better transit system. Why is that? It's the same thing. It's just moving people. Why do we treat those so differently? And ultimately, I think our proposition is that we treat those so differently because the people for whom this would be such a huge benefit haven't had a voice in the conversation.
I've often thought that was really strange too. When I was in Austin, the big thing was that in 2000 was a light rail election, and I always thought it was strange that you could build toll roads and you could build roads to everywhere, and then you had to have a vote just to just to raise money to approve whether you were going to build a light rail line or not. Seemed really strange, and I've always kind of operated off that premise that it seems really strange that we're not thinking about a total mobility. We're just thinking about gas taxes for cars, and that's it, especially in Washington State, and then you have to fight for yourself in these other places. But let's talk about the transportation access for everyone story map. I was really excited to kind of click through on the website some of the stories before going into the paper. Where did the idea for this come from, and what is included?
Yeah, so my background before I started doing disability work was in organizing with labor. And so I always believe in bringing people together. And I did video work for unions for years and years. And I came to see that it wasn't so much about the videos that we produced being shared or becoming viral on social media. The act of someone being public and sharing their story publicly actually transformed their participation and their confidence and allowed them to engage in a new way, and it really made them committed to the work in a way that was powerful. And so the idea for the story map came from that, right? That in asking people to share something about themselves that is risky, right? There's so much shame around not driving in our country. People are embarrassed to admit it, especially if they're perceived as able-bodied. If you can't drive, it makes it really difficult to get a job. It can make it difficult to have kids. I mean, there's there's a lot of reasons people, even if they can't drive or can't drive comfortably, continue to drive and don't want to disclose that they can't. So we wanted to have this be a place where people could share something about themselves that felt a little risky, felt a bit like, coming out of the closet in some ways, and recognize that there were many other people in the same situation, and that together, if we start to act as a collective, we can start to shift the conversation and insist that we should be part of the conversation as well. So that's sort of my my philosophical background on organizing and why we're doing this as organizing work. And one other point too is that it's a lot of times people want to collect stories from people and then use those stories in tokenizing ways. And there is always some element of that in the work we do, but like we are actively trying to combat that tendency by encouraging people and involving people and making sure that this is actually about them having a seat at the table and being involved and engaging and creating the most accessible space we can to allow people who haven't engaged before to engage. And so that's how we shift power and not just use people as, symbols.
That work is just so powerful and has been, what Anna just described. I've seen that, when folks who use a wheelchair or who have a visual impairment and can't drive, then come and testify at our, House or Senate transportation commissions or, on different committees and say, you try it. You try to navigate the streets without sidewalks that we've built. It really has an impact it changes the conversation, but also really strangely, often those voices are the only quote unquote real voices that join those conversations. Everybody else is somehow a paid hack that's associated with a project that has a long tail of project development, that has a constituency and created its own weather because a lot of money has been put into it already because it's a big highway project or it's something else. But when lady that Anna has worked with tells the story of taking 3 buses that take an hour and a half to try to get to Kmart, and she gets there, but there is 60 feet of missing sidewalk, so she can't get to the crosswalk to actually get to the other side of the street to get to Kmart. It's a much more impactful and a much more real picture of what's actually not happening in our transportation systems than I'm sure that everybody listening has probably been at one of these meetings where people say, I need such and such a place, such and such a road to be built and extra lane miles to be added to this place because congestion. And people expect that naturally there's this kind of, head nodding and understanding, oh, that situation is terrible. It's terrible. You should sort of feel kind of pain for those people that are trapped in congestion. But it's an entirely different thing when somebody says, I actually can't complete that trip because there's 60 feet of missing sidewalks. And that 60 feet of missing sidewalk is not a mega project. For Crystal, there's nobody advocating for it.
Yeah, that story was so powerful because of the small amount of distance that you had to go. You got most of the way, and then you couldn't get the rest of the way because of the mud and getting stuck. And it's just doesn't seem fair. But that encompasses too, this kind of collection of expertise that you all have put together. And I've seen a number of the articles that you all were quoted in for after you released the project, talking about that specifically, is that, these are folks who we should be valuing their expertise because they live it. They're in it all the time. They're trying to get to places and they're learning what they can and can't do. And we often take, experts as people who have studied, something for a long period of time. And they've just done their 10,000 hours. It's just they're doing it as they live day by day. And so what's the power of this expertise that you've collected, the stories of folks and the coordination that, putting them together in categories that can actually inform change?
Yeah, I think, it is this expertise, right? That 10,000 hours thing is a really good way to talk about it. People who can't drive, we are out there using the system day in and day out, and it's taking a long time to get where we need to go. And so we are thinking about it. Like the amount of time I think about our transportation system, anytime I need to go anywhere, especially out here in the West that, is in this auto-designed, whatever, utopia for cars, it's immense. And the other thing I think about this lived experience expertise that we've really been able to tap into and people seem kind of surprised by is the passion that people have to change the system, because it is something that, us as non-drivers, we are out there thinking about, oh my gosh, if only there was a light here to cross the street to my bus stop, so I didn't have to try to dash across 6 lanes of, highway. If only there wasn't a giant puddle at the base of this ramp that I have to roll through or step through every time. Like there is And so when people have the opportunity to engage, they are more than willing and more than excited to show up and hope to be listened to. And we really have to start to, I think, change the way our transportation departments and transit agencies think about hiring people and paying people with this kind of experience to bring them in and get that knowledge. And one thing we've sort of tapped into a little bit is just that so many of these job postings require driver's licenses when they don't need to, right? It's not like we're saying that if you're a bus driver, yes, you need a CDL, but there's a lot of, planning jobs, data jobs, other types of jobs out there. There's no good reason people should be requiring driver's licenses, and yet they are. And then you're just automatically excluding a whole bunch of us who could offer a lot of knowledge and expertise to improve the system.
What kind of jobs are they requiring licenses for? Why would they do that if it's not necessary, if you're not delivering or driving, or what's the...
We hear various explanations. I mean, it tends to be an automatic thing on a lot of these HR checklists. And so when the job gets entered into the HR system, it's just automatically checked. So that's sort of the most, innocuous. There's other times where people will make really good arguments or whatever. They think they're really good arguments to me about why a planning job or a fundraising job or a QuickBooks job needs to have, the person needs to have a driver's license. Well, what if, they needed to somehow get across the state to this other thing? And we know there's no good transit, and it's true, there is no good transit, but there are ways around that. And especially if you're a transit agency or an advocacy group that works to improve transit, I really think there's an imperative to try harder and recognize that, sure, it might take that person a little longer to get somewhere, but that's okay. And in getting there, they are going to be gaining a lot of knowledge and experience just using the system. So I think one other thing that Paulo hit on a little bit earlier, and I think is really important, is that we aren't just talking about improving transit and walkability and rollability in urban areas or in population centers. I think we have very consciously focused on doing advocacy throughout the state and through our more rural, through our farming areas. And I think, part of that is really critical because of the gentrification, the increased pricing housing in our more urban areas, but also just that, there's no reason our more rural areas shouldn't have at least, hourly or a couple times a day transit service. And right now they just don't. And there are so many folks, including so many seniors and folks in our tribal areas, farm workers, right, who don't have access to cars and live in these more rural areas currently and could benefit immensely from having better transportation access. So I just think that is something that I think is really relevant to the national conversation, that we can't just be talking about cities. We need to be dreaming bigger than that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And what an engine of inequality we've set up for ourselves, where, to fund transit, you need these basic requirements. You need to have a progressive general voting population that will vote to tax themselves to pay for transit operations. And you need to have progressive politicians who are willing to put those measures on the ballot. Those things tend to coincide really heavily with pretty well-to-do areas right now in America. So the people that are just incredibly left out in this equation are poor people and communities of color who have the misfortune of living in areas that are conservative and led by Republican politicians, because they will never be able to get the transit that they need because they can't get it on the ballot. And even if they did, they probably can't get those things approved. And so it really it's creating this engine of inequality where the urban wealthy areas have the ability to tax themselves to create better transit, and the exurban and rural areas are getting left behind. And you have this sort of really sick situation where walking, biking, and transit are becoming elite activities, where reurbanization is bringing wealthier people back to the traditional city cores that have a connected grid, that spent the money to build the sidewalks back in the day, and the suburbs that have this disconnected network with no sidewalks that are harder to serve with transit, frankly, and don't have the tax base to provide this basic service. Going back to the indoor toilet example, absolutely, there are economies of scale, right? We have water treatment plants in places that are very urban and that where you have a mass of folks that can fund that. And we figured out how to do septic tanks in places that are less dense. But everybody has a toilet inside now, right? So we need to sort of figure out how we provide this basic element of living in society so that people can get to the things that they need, regardless of whether you're in the big metropolitan area or you're in a smaller city or a less dense place.
You'd be surprised actually about how many places in the United States still don't have toilets. It's required, obviously, but there was, I think, a Guardian article recently of talking about how there was a number of neighborhoods around the country that still don't have indoor plumbing. And it's a real issue. And obviously, we have the lead pipe issue and the number of things. But I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying, like, we still have that problem, too, to take care of in a number of places. Sometimes when I was looking at census data, I used to do a lot of mapping in my work. And there were places in a place like Baltimore, the lower income areas, that still didn't have indoor pipes and plumbing, which was really surprising to me that still existed, but it still exists. And so, like you're saying, I mean, that's a regulation and a requirement, but we're still, fighting those demons of trying to get everybody on the same page. And I think that transportation is even further behind in that aspect. And you're completely right about that. I want to ask about the report specifically, and how you combine topics and pulled from people's experiences and created a set of groupings that could provide information for decision makers, people at agencies. How did you end up figuring out which topics that you wanted to talk about when you were putting those together for the report?
I had a wonderful assistant, Kimberly Kinchin. She's great. And she helped me. We, read back through all the stories, and then both of us sort of generated these lists of things that we were hearing and wanted to pull out as topics and then combine those. And it was an immense amount of work. None of it was done through any of the word cloudy type situations. We really tried to include almost every interview at that point into the research paper and make sure that those voices were being heard. And, there were a lot of areas of consensus and actually a surprising amount of overlap. I was a little afraid going in that we would hear, such different things, that because our state is, very geographically diverse, and we have, people with disabilities have very, very different needs. And yet there were really consistent themes throughout. And I think the big theme, the big takeaway was just the importance of sidewalks. And that, I think, is something that doesn't get a lot of attention, or hasn't historically gotten as much attention as other issues in transportation, because able-bodied people perhaps can sort of figure out workarounds. But if you are transit dependent, and especially if you are disabled, sidewalks are that critical connection. Without them, you are much more isolated. You're much more dependent on paratransit or rides from friends or service providers. And so they really are like a liberating technology, and something we could be thinking about much more deeply, and should be investing in much more, and should be maintaining, and should be building, and all of that. So I think that to me was the big takeaway from the work, was just, wow, sidewalks are our Achilles heel right now in our transportation system for many folks who need it the most.
Yeah, that was interesting. In addition to that, there was a piece I remember reading of somebody who rolled off of the edge of a bus stop because there were low vision markings that had been placed in the wrong place. So there's like this issue of building the infrastructure like sidewalks and making sure that it's there, but also building it right. Yeah. It seemed like that was an issue as well, is building it correctly, not just building it.
Yeah. I mean, like the ADA, there's such a backlog of things that are legally required, right? And have been for 30 years. And we just haven't taken it seriously. Like in our state, we don't even know, right? Each jurisdiction is supposed to come up with an ADA transition plan. And many of those have never been submitted to the state. We have no sense of what the total amount of improvements, like the budget amount is. Just, we don't. And we don't really want to know, I think. And then there's beyond just what is strictly required by the ADA. I think what gets really difficult for many disabled folks is that you have a lot of urban planners who want to try out new and fun and experimental design ideas for bike lanes and transit stops. And, and each one of those interfaces then becomes something else, a new thing that someone has to figure out. And if you're blind or you're using a service animal, that can be really, really challenging. And so that lack of standardization, while it may allow for innovation, actually is another barrier for folks.
And the pathways by which sidewalks get built is similar to what we were saying before. It's just, for some reason, a totally different process. So here's a sort of thing that we heard recently when Anna and I were doing a presentation at the Washington State Transportation Commission. There was a commissioner who also happens to be a city council member at a smaller city in Washington State, who told us he's been trying to pave a section of town sidewalks, to create sidewalks in the section of town for 11 years and hasn't been able to do it because the process of actually building a sidewalk is much harder than maybe building a highway. That he needs to create a local improvement district. He needs to go and deal with property rights issues. He needs to go and charge the individual homeowners. Can you imagine going to the homeowners and saying, hey, we're gonna have to assess your property in order to build this sidewalk? And imagine how many blocks of sidewalk you don't build because that's the way that we've decided to provide, like Anna is saying, this critical piece of the transportation network. We're piecemealing it in this incredibly inefficient way. And so, a lot of the way that we talk about this is to say that we have all of the things that we need in order to make a dramatic difference in all of these things, but we need the commitment. We seem to tolerate really incredibly poor levels of infrastructure that are right next to an excellent, very high quality road. And the only reason why we tolerate those is because there are some people in society that we say matter, and then there are some people that we say matter a lot less. And so, our approach at Front and Center is to take a very, that's in the name, is to say, people of color that have been marginalized in society systematically need to be front and centered in making decisions that affect our lives going forward. And that is, a road like Paul Tabeoyon, who's one of our key partners at Front and Centered, lives in Yakima and has a disability. He works with the Association of Pacific Islander Coalition in Yakima, and he often tells the story of what waiting for the bus is like for him. And literally what it means is it's standing in somebody's yard because there's no sidewalk, or standing on the road. And it's a road that has, 40-mile-an-hour traffic, posted speed limit 40-mile-an-hour traffic, but the actual traffic is much higher. And when you look at that picture, you see this incredible disparity sort of in the built environment right there. Because the pictures that I haven't been there in person yet, I really want to go out there and walk those streets with him. But that street looks like a piece of glass. It's so smooth in the pictures that he shows us, right? I mean, they've taken good care of that road. And yet there's no sidewalk, and when the snow plow comes, the snow plows, shoves the snow onto this person's yard, and then he's waiting for the bus on the street in front of a mound of snow. And there's no reason except for we've said, hey, Paul, you're a person of color who lives in Yakima, who has a disability. You matter less than the people who can drive. And so, I think, it's so important about the work that Anna's doing and the work that we're doing at Front and Centered is to attack that at its root, is to, so we created a transportation bill of rights. And to say there's, very first among that, people have the right not to be killed or maimed when they're going about their daily business. And people have the right to a clean place to live with clean air and clean water that's not being polluted by other people getting by your house to do their transportation stuff. And it's a radically different conversation than the conversation that's usually at place in terms of, well, how are we going to allocate funds for this or for that? Or, we can't do that because the 18th Amendment says the gas tax can only be used for this purpose or that purpose. And we think that, there are lots and lots of people who want to contribute to this and say, particularly in light of the nexus between transportation and climate and the climate injustice that's perpetrating, that's making it more difficult for communities of color, for people with disability to be able to thrive. And so I invite all the folks that are listening to look at the white paper, to also look at the Transportation Bill of Rights that we have up on our site at Front and Centered, and see how you can add to that conversation or join that conversation somehow and expand it, because it's an exciting moment. We feel like we're in conversations with the right leaders in Washington, that they are hearing this message in a different way.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you is, when you share the Bill of Rights with people, what kind of responses do you get? What do people, say? Are they dismissive of it, or are they accepting of it? Is it something that's easy to get across, or is it harder? I mean, it's interesting to think about it that way.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I could see in the Zoom that Anna's laughing, because we've had this experience so often where we say these things and people say, there's nothing I disagree with here. You're totally right, but we can't do any of those things, right? And that's what we heard last year from, elected officials and, from folks in our coalitions as well. And then this year, what we're seeing is the conversation is changing tone quite a bit. And the things that were impossible last year are being more mainstream asks. And so I think it is the right approach to take. And it's a really hopeful one, ultimately. It's saying that, this isn't just a conversation for experts. It isn't just a conversation about boring infrastructure. It's a core part of your civil rights, is to be able to be safe on the roads where you need to travel, regardless of whether you're 9 or whether you're 99, whether you can see or you can't see.
What was it that changed people's perception? Was it the pandemic? Was it some of the weather-related things that happened last year? I mean, you had some really high temperatures. You've had snow recently. Lots of really impactful climate-related things in addition to a pandemic. Were those the kind of the catalysts, or was it something else? Was it just you all doing really good work?
I think honestly, the climate stuff, because everyone, we're in a very democratic part of a democratic state. And so, the climate conversation among Democrats here is not, people get that it's a crisis, at least, And so I think what has shifted, I think, is actually talking about the unmet need and highlighting the needs of our communities, the frontline communities and non-drivers in particular. And I think those voices just haven't been a major part of transportation conversations in particular. Like, there's lots of good community organizing going on in lots of spaces, but in the statewide transportation space, people just they literally just hear from lobbyists, and they don't hear from directly impacted communities who want something different, like actually want more funding for transit, actually want sidewalks like that. Instead, they hear about, we need, this is the trucking association needs whatever. And so I think that shifted it a bit. We also did this Week Without Driving challenge. It was our first attempt of it. I think it was great. I think people who agreed to do it were probably people who were already sympathetic, but even for them, I think, and many of them do occasionally ride transit or occasionally ride a bike or try to do that, frequently even, but they still all have cars and still all have the option of bailing when the weather is bad or when the kid needs to go somewhere late at night or, when they need to carry a bunch of groceries. And to think about what it would be like to not have that option for just a week, I think for a lot of them was a bit revolutionary, and that they recognize that, oh, wow, the system really, it might work some of the time, but it doesn't work all the time, or it only works for these things and not for these other things. And so I think that has begun to shift the conversation a little bit. And that is definitely something that I think we want to try to grow and expand in future years and try to get more participation across our state and perhaps in other states as well. The climate piece is really interesting because we work in the context of these climate conversations in Washington state because we have so much hydropower. Transportation is our largest greenhouse gas contributor. And so we have to be tackling transportation, but how we do that and whose needs get prioritized in how we change in that just transition or not so just transition, I think is really key. And so that's where, it's become a point of conversation about, are we focusing on electrification or are we talking about building sidewalks? I mean, yes, we should be doing both, but, funding is limited. Are we building transit? Whose needs in where all this funding is getting steered are getting prioritized? And that is something that I think we're really focused on right now is making sure that in these conversations, we are really clear that non-drivers and frontline communities, we are the environmental leaders, we are the climate leaders. And by doing the things that make it easier and safer and less dangerous, and that we need to thrive in our communities, by doing those things first, that's actually how we're going to get to reach our climate goals most easily and in a way that is both equitable and ultimately serves all of us the most.
Yeah, absolutely. We did a bunch of listening sessions with communities all across the state last year and said, well, what are your priorities for transportation? And over again, people said they want better transit, cleaner air, safer streets. And yet, when you match that up with the way in which the legislature was proposing to spend $16 billion of money, those priorities were not sort of rising to the top. It really, really was an entirely different set of needs that were being met. And I think that what Anna just said about, hey, there is a really clear nexus here between justice and climate action. That a Tesla in every driveway, not only is it not feasible, it actually is not in line with the justice outcomes that we should all be looking for, right? Imagine going to the family whose child was killed by a car and say, well, at least that was an electric car, right? That's absurd. We have so many disparities that will not be solved by electrification, and ignoring those is not going to do us any good. We need to electrify, but we need to do it equitably, and it's not going to solve every single problem.
Yeah, I agree. It's tough to have those conversations with people who are the true believers, right? It's frustrating sometimes because I do agree we need electrification, but at the same time, the rules of the road are, as it pertains to pedestrians and active transportation, seem they're not quite correct yet. So it's frustrating.
Or tell those people in Virginia that were stuck in their cars for 48 hours or 24 hours or whatever, and saying, aren't you glad you were in an electric car? That doesn't make any sense. It's like, I think, Jarrett Walker talks about elite projection, and that seems to be the thing that we're struggling against. And that's the beauty of the week without a car, is to say, well, let's put down your elite projection for a bit and experience the world as it is for so many different people. And it's powerful.
It's really good to read some of those media clips about some of the elected officials that, they've used transit before and they use it, for their lives, but then they get their kind of world upended by having to do it for a week. I find that in other places, I mean, yours seemed very successful from that standpoint. I find in other places, the only people, I guess there was a challenge for one day here in San Francisco, and it didn't seem to have the same effect on people's minds as maybe the one that you all did. So kudos for that, to change minds.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, we changed some minds, we opened some eyes. I think we got a little bit of, awareness, but at the end of the day, these are going to be hard political choices that our elected leaders are going to have to make. And the only way they're going to make them is if, they have to. And that's why we have to organize, right? It's not just awareness that's going to change their mind. It's fear of political consequences. And so that is why the organizing, I think, is so critical. We can't just rely on people feeling compassionate. That's not enough.
Well, so if folks want to look for and find the story map or the Bill of Rights, where can they find them?
Sure. So you can follow Disability Mobility Initiative on Twitter. We are just on Twitter these days at DisMobility. And then we also have a website. You can look at us at disabilityrightswashington.org.
And it's just frontandcentered.org. And you can see the Transportation Bill of Rights there and all of the work that we've done in partnership with Disability Rights Washington to really, change the conversation that we're having in terms of transportation systems.
And I want to make sure people go to the story map and to read the Bill of Rights because, there's a lot of stories in there where we talked about a couple of stories and a couple of the things that, were featured in the report, but there's so many in there and it kind of opens your eyes to seeing the world from a different perspective than maybe you did if you were able-bodied. So I definitely recommend people go and check it out and maybe read a couple of stories. It's really easy to flick through the stories. There's a little, there's a little thing you just click through. It's almost like surfing Instagram, really, to be honest. It's really that simple. So I hope that folks can go and check it out because it's really powerful. And I hope that people not just in Washington, obviously, check it out, because I think I mentioned earlier on, I feel like this is very relevant to people around the country and the world, not just in Washington State. So I appreciate that as well.
Awesome. Yeah. And thank you. And you can also follow, I think Paulo and I are both on Twitter as ourselves as well, and can sometimes be a little spicier than our institutions. So you can follow us on Twitter individually. I'm at Anna Zivarts, ANNAZIVARTS. And Paulo, your Twitter handle
is PNU Moves.
Awesome. Well, Anna and Paulo, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great conversation.
Thanks for having us. That was awesome.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Kidways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and posted first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can sign up for our 15-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. And you can listen to the show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.